I never wanted to be a caretaker. The job was easy, sure, but it wasn't something I had ever imagined myself doing. It just sort of happened. I was between jobs, struggling to keep up with bills, and a friend told me about a place outside of town that needed someone to watch over it. A cemetery. The owner, an old man named Howard, was retiring, and they needed someone to take care of the land, keep the grass trimmed, make sure no one vandalized anything, and handle the occasional burial. It wasn't exactly my dream job, but it came with a small cabin on the property, rent-free. That was enough to get me to say yes. The cemetery was about 5 miles out from the nearest town, surrounded by dense trees. The main road led straight to the entrance, where an old iron gate stood, rusted and bent in places. Beyond that was the graveyard itself, a quiet stretch of land with headstones scattered in uneven rows. Some were new, polished, and well-kept, while others were old and cracked, barely standing. And then there was the cabin. It sat at the back of the property, just past the last row of graves, near the tree line. It was small, 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. The walls were old wood, stained dark from years of weather. It had been used by caretakers before me, but it still smelled like dust and damp wood. Howard handed me the keys, gave me a brief rundown of what I needed to do, and then left. That first night, I barely slept. Even though I was exhausted from moving my things in, I couldn't get comfortable. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside, every distant sound from the cemetery had me wide awake. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was just unsettling. I kept telling myself it was just a job, just a place, nothing more. I woke up early the next morning and got to work. I walked the property, checking the fence line. Some of the headstones had been knocked over, probably by age, so I made a mental note to see if I could fix them later. The trees cast long shadows over the graves, making everything feel colder than it should have been. The days were easy. The nights were not. By the third night, I was convinced I was hearing things. It started off small, a rustling in the trees, a soft scraping sound near the cabin. At first, I told myself it was just animals. There were plenty of them in the area. Foxes, raccoons, even the occasional deer. But then I started hearing footsteps. They were distant at first, coming from somewhere near the graves. Slow, steady. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. My breath fogged in front of me as I shined the light over the graves. Nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking. But the sound of footsteps had stopped. I stayed outside for a few minutes, scanning the area, but I didn't see anything. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I locked the cabin door anyway. A week passed, and I started to settle into a routine. Mornings were spent taking care of the cemetery, pulling weeds, trimming the grass, cleaning up fallen branches. Afternoons were quiet. Evenings were colder than they should have been. And at night, I kept hearing the footsteps. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. They would start at the same time just after midnight. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the graves. Sometimes I would hear them stop, pause for a while, then start again. Every time I went outside to check, there was nothing, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. One night, I decided to stay up and wait. I turned off the lights in the cabin, sat by the window, and watched. The moon was out, casting pale light over the graveyard. The wind was still. Everything was quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the far side of the cemetery. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my heart pounding. The sound was getting closer. Not running, not stumbling, just slow, steady steps moving through the graves. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. Nothing. but I knew I had heard it. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching, waiting, but the footsteps never came back. The next morning, I found something near one of the graves. Footprints. They were faint, just impressions in the dirt, but they were there.
Bare footprints. No shoes. No socks.
Just the shape of feet pressed into the ground. And they were fresh. I followed them for a while, but they faded as they neared the trees. I didn't know what to think. That night, I locked the door and shut all the windows. I told myself that if I just ignored it, it would go away. Didn't. The footsteps came back, louder this time, closer, and then I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing right outside the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound stayed for what felt like hours just beyond the wall, just outside the window. Then finally it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun came up, I had already made my decision. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and walked to my truck. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the job, about the free cabin. None of it was worth this. As I started the engine, I glanced toward the cemetery one last time. There, standing among the graves, was a man, barefoot, still, watching me. I drove away and never went back. That was years ago. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I was right to leave. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just a break from the noise of everyday life. I had rented an old cabin, tucked away on a small farm in the middle of nowhere. The idea was simple: escape the chaos for a few days, unwind, and reconnect with nature. No cell service, no distractions, just me, the cabin, and the wilderness surrounding it. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a small field, framed by a dense, quiet forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. I remember driving down that long, winding road, the trees thickening as I moved further into the heart of nowhere. The clouds were low that day, and the air smelled fresh, almost earthy. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still damp. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a muted, somber light. As I turned off the main road and onto a smaller gravel path, the tires kicked up little plumes of dust that hung in the air for a moment before settling again. The cabin came into view soon after, sitting alone on the far edge of the property. I wasn't expecting luxury. The cabin was simple, wooden, with a weathered roof and a stone chimney curling out smoke into the sky. There was a small porch with a rocking chair and a rusty old lantern hanging by the door. It was charming in a way, but definitely showing its age. It looked like it hadn't seen much attention in the past few years. Inside, it was cozy. The floors creaked with every step, and the smell of old wood and must filled the air. The furniture was rustic, mismatched, but functional. A worn leather couch sat in front of a fireplace, and a thick woolen rug covered the floor. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, with an old wood stove, a small refrigerator, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. It wasn't much, but it felt like the perfect retreat. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bag and making myself at home. There was a stack of firewood by the fireplace, so I started a small fire to warm the place up. The flames flickered and danced, casting soft shadows on the walls. I spent the next few hours enjoying the peace and quiet. I cooked a simple meal, nothing fancy, and ate while I watched the fire burn low. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and rustle. The air felt heavy, like a storm might be on the way. As night fell, I began to feel that familiar unease that comes with being alone in a secluded place. The creaks of the old cabin seemed louder in the silence, the wind outside sounding like distant whispers. But I shook it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I wasn't used to being completely alone in a place like this, but it was nice, too. No one around, no distractions, just a few quiet days to reset my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel a little jumpy. The wind outside had picked up, and the rain began to fall again, hitting the roof in a rhythmic patter. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep, but every so often, I would hear something that made me sit up, listening. A faint thud, the sound of something shifting. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, old wood moving under the pressure of the wind and rain. But then, around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. At first, I thought it was just a trick of my mind, maybe a branch hitting the side of the cabin in the wind. But then there was another knock, this time louder. It echoed through the empty house. My heart started racing, and I slowly got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I moved cautiously to the window and peered outside into the darkness. There was no one there. I stood there for a few moments, staring into the rain-soaked night. The wind howled, and the trees creaked and groaned, but everything seemed still. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal or some debris falling against the cabin, but the feeling of unease remained. I locked the door and went back to bed, trying to push the thought from my mind. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, I tried to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. The sun had come out, casting a pale light over the land, and the storm had moved off. I took a walk around the property to explore. The field around the cabin was overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers, and in the distance, I could see the edge of the forest. There was a barn a little further off, its roof sagging with age, and an old, rusted tractor sitting in the yard. The place had been abandoned for some time, but it was peaceful. I spent the morning exploring the area, but the strange feeling from the night before lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was never anyone. I figured it was just my nerves, but the feeling wouldn't go away. By mid-afternoon, I was back inside the cabin, reading a book by the fire. The rain had started up again, tapping softly against the windows. It was soothing in a way, but also isolating. I thought about the knock from the night before, but I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. The place was old, and the wind played tricks on you. Still, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. As the evening approached, I decided to take another walk, this time around the back of the cabin. The sun was setting, and the sky had turned a muted orange. The wind had died down, and everything was eerily quiet. As I walked behind the cabin, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud. They were large, deep imprints, and they led from the edge of the forest to the back of the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't heard anyone approach. I crouched down and examined the prints. They were fresh, no more than a few hours old. I looked around, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was no sign of anyone around, but the tracks were clear. They hadn't been there when I had walked around earlier. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Could someone have been here? Maybe someone from the nearby town? I told myself it was probably just a neighbor, but something didn't feel right. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The unease had turned into full-blown anxiety now. I tried to focus on something, anything, but my mind kept racing back to those footprints. Had someone been watching me? That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt amplified. The fear gripped me, making my chest tighten. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see someone standing out there, but there was nothing. The hours dragged on, and I finally dozed off from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I woke to a thick fog hanging over the property. It was a strange, low mist that seemed to cover everything, making the world look like it had been swallowed whole. I was on edge, but I couldn't sit in the cabin all day. I had to get out. I decided to check the barn, hoping to find something that would explain what had happened. As I walked through the fog, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The world was unnervingly silent, the only sound being the crunch of my boots against the wet earth. When I reached the barn, I hesitated before opening the door. It creaked loudly as I pulled it open, revealing a dark interior filled with old hay bales, rusted farm tools, and broken furniture. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the shadows. The air smelled damp and stale. The door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. But then I saw it. In the corner of the barn, there was a small pile of leaves, almost like someone had been hiding something there. I approached cautiously, my hand trembling. As I moved the leaves aside, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A torn, blood-stained shirt. My mind raced as I took in the scene. The shirt was fresh, the blood still bright, not dried. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I backed out of the barn slowly, my mind whirling with questions. Was someone here? Had they been hiding here? The footprints, the knock at the door, the shirt. Everything pointed to one terrifying conclusion. I was not alone. The rest of the day passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting. The isolation that had seemed so peaceful before now felt like a trap. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed my things and drove away, my eyes constantly scanning the road behind me, half expecting someone to follow. I never found out who had been on the property that night or why they were there. But as I drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief. The cabin, the barn, the tracks in the mud, they were all behind me now. Whatever had happened, whatever had been lurking out there, it was no longer my problem. I had no intention of returning, but part of me still wonders, what was that shirt doing in the barn? Who had been watching me and why? And will I ever truly know what happened that weekend? It was one of those days when everything felt off, the air thick with unspoken tension, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The kind of day where your heart just knows something is about to happen, even if your brain can't make sense of it yet. I had been driving for hours. The road stretched out ahead of me in a never-ending loop of asphalt and trees, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The kind of rain that makes you feel like you're trapped inside a world that doesn't quite care about your existence. It had been 5 years since I last set foot on that road. 5 years since the divorce. 5 years since I'd made the decision to leave. We weren't on bad terms, at least not in the way most people expect after a divorce. My ex-husband, Luke, and I just grew apart. We had different dreams, different lives, and eventually we stopped pretending that things would go back to how they once were. But there was something that had always stayed with me, the cabin. Luke's cabin was a place that once held everything we'd wanted. It was small but cozy, tucked away deep in the woods, far from any city or town. I remembered the long weekends we spent there, cutting firewood, hiking through the trees, and pretending we had no cares in the world. Felt like home, in a way I couldn't quite explain. But after the divorce, it felt like a place I needed to forget. Yet here I was driving back to it. The reason was simple. My parents had asked me to collect some of the things I left behind. Old furniture, clothes I hadn't worn in years. I didn't need them, but it was a request I couldn't turn down. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe guilt, but I'd agreed. And now, as I passed the familiar landmarks along the way, I felt a strange knot form in my stomach. The cabin was just up ahead, a few more miles down the road. I hadn't seen it in years, but I knew it as well as I knew my own name. The road curved, and the trees seemed to close in on me, the world becoming quieter with each mile. The car's tires hummed against the pavement, and I felt an uneasy anticipation creep up my spine. I didn't know what I expected. Luke had long since moved on, remarried even. He wasn't going to be there, not that I wanted him to be. But there was something about returning to that place. Something about revisiting the past that made my pulse race. The cabin came into view, and my breath caught in my throat. It looked the same, and yet it felt different. The wooden structure, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, still stood proudly, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of time. The windows were dark, reflecting the overcast sky, and the front porch, once a place of laughter and lazy afternoons, now looked abandoned, like the life that once filled it had been swept away. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin. The air was heavy, as though something was waiting, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was just nerves. I hadn't been back here since I left, and now, with my ex's shadow still lingering in my mind, I was unsure of what I'd find. Finally, I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots. The ground was damp, the sky still threatening rain, but I wasn't going to back out now. I grabbed the small duffel bag I had packed with a few necessities and started toward the front door. The porch creaked beneath my weight as I approached, and I reached for the doorknob. It was cold, almost clammy, but the door opened with a soft groan. I stepped inside, immediately hit by the smell of old wood and dust. It was as if the cabin had been waiting for me, holding its breath all this time. The living room looked exactly as I remembered it. Old furniture that had been there when we first bought the place, a fireplace that had long since lost its warmth, and a worn-out rug that had seen better days. There was a sense of emptiness, as if the walls were still holding onto the memories of happier times. I made my way to the back room where I used to sleep. The bed was still there, the sheets in disarray, as though someone had lain there recently. But that wasn't possible. No one had been here in years. I tried to shake off the strange feeling in my stomach, but it lingered, pressing against my chest like a weight. I went about my task, grabbing what I needed: old clothes, a few books, and some photos. I stuffed them into the duffel bag and made my way back to the front door, ready to leave. But as I passed the window, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the trees outside. But then I saw it again, a figure moving just beyond the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer I looked, the more certain I became that someone was out there. I froze. The figure was tall, obscured by the thick trees, but there was something unsettling about the way it moved. It wasn't natural. It was as if it was circling the cabin, moving from one shadow to the next, never fully stepping into the light. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I instinctively backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was it Luke? No, it couldn't be. He didn't live here anymore. And yet, the figure moved with such purpose, such deliberate slowness, that I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting. I grabbed my bag and rushed back to the car, my pulse thundering in my ears. The rain had started to fall, light at first, but quickly turning heavier. I couldn't see anything now through the mist, but I felt eyes on me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the car door, barely managing to get inside. I started the engine and pulled away, the gravel crunching under the tires. But as I looked back one last time, I saw it. Just for a split second, the figure standing at the edge of the woods watching me go. I didn't stop, couldn't. I didn't look back again as I drove down the road, the rain pouring down in sheets, the wipers struggling to keep up. My heart was still racing, my mind still trying to process what I had seen. But there was one thing I knew for certain. I wasn't alone out there. Not anymore. The rest of the drive was uneventful, my mind still racing with thoughts of the figure, of the cabin. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. And even as I pulled into my driveway hours later, it was still there. The weight of it, the sensation that something or someone was lurking just beyond my reach. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I got a call. It was from the sheriff's department. They had found a body near the cabin. A man. They didn't know who he was, but the description was chilling, tall, dressed in dark clothing, and with a strange gait. The sheriff asked if I knew anyone who might fit that description. I didn't, but as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something or someone. I never went back to that cabin again. Couldn't. The memories of that night, of the figure in the woods, would follow me for the rest of my life. The sheriff never found out who the man was. The case went cold, but I knew the truth. The figure I had seen that night wasn't just a shadow of the past. It was something darker, something that had been waiting all along. I never wanted to own a cabin. It wasn't a dream of mine to have some remote getaway in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of dense forest with nothing but the sound of wind through the trees. But life has a way of throwing things at you when you least expect it. This cabin belonged to my uncle. I wasn't particularly close to him, but when he passed away in 2017, I was surprised to find out he had left the place to me. My mother told me it was probably because I was the only one in the family who enjoyed the outdoors, the only one who might have actually used it. She wasn't wrong. It was an old log cabin deep in the woods of Montana, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The only way in was a narrow dirt road that twisted through the trees, barely wide enough for my truck. The place had no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove for heat and an old hand pump well for drinking water. I had no real plans for the cabin, but after some time, I figured it would be a good place to get away, to clear my head. Life had been wearing me down, and the thought of a few weeks alone, with nothing but nature, sounded perfect. I packed up my truck with supplies, canned food, bottled water, a rifle for hunting, and a pistol for safety. It took me nearly an hour to drive the rough road leading up to the cabin. The trees grew thicker the farther I went, the branches reaching overhead and blotting out the late afternoon sky. When I finally pulled up, I sat in the truck for a long moment, just looking at it. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it from my childhood. A simple one-room structure with a small porch out front. It was solid, but it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were dusty, the wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the door stuck a little when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The furniture was still there. A small table, a few chairs, and an old cot in the corner. My uncle's belongings were gone, but it still felt like his place. I spent the first couple of days chopping wood, cleaning, and making sure everything was in order. The days were peaceful, quiet, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. At night, the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the wood stove and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Then, on the third night, something changed. I was sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, staring up at the stars when I heard something in the woods. A branch snapping. It wasn't the sound of a small animal, not the quick scurry of a squirrel or the soft padding of a deer. It was something heavier, something deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a bear, maybe the wind. The next morning, I found tracks near the cabin. At first, I thought they were coyote tracks, but the longer I looked at them, the less sense they made. They were almost human, but not quite. The toes were too long, the shape slightly wrong. I felt a chill creep up my spine. That night, the noises came back. The sound of footsteps circling the cabin, slow and steady. Every few minutes, I'd hear a low, guttural noise, like a growl, but not quite. I grabbed my rifle and sat by the door, heart pounding. Then, around midnight, something tapped on the window. Not a hard knock, just a soft, deliberate tap. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The fire in the wood stove cast shadows across the walls, and in that flickering light, I saw something through the window. A face. Not a human face. Not an animal's. It was something in between. The skin was stretched too tight, the mouth too wide, the eyes black and empty. It was staring right at me. I raised the rifle, but by the time I got to my feet, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside sent my heart racing. The next morning, I found more tracks circling the cabin. I knew, deep down, that whatever this was, it wasn't going away. That evening, I built a fire outside, hoping it would keep whatever it was at bay. I kept my rifle close, my pistol even closer. The sounds started again, just after sundown. This time, they were louder, closer. The footsteps moved quickly, darting from tree to tree. I could hear breathing, ragged and uneven. Then, just past the firelight, I saw it. It was standing there, just beyond the reach of the flames. Tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It wasn't moving, just watching. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could hit anything. Then it spoke. It didn't sound right. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It was like someone trying to copy human speech but getting it wrong. It said my name. I don't remember pulling the trigger, but suddenly my rifle was going off. The thing moved fast, too fast. It disappeared into the darkness, and for the next few hours, everything was quiet. But I knew it was still out there. At first light, I packed up my things. I didn't care about leaving supplies behind. I didn't care about the cabin. I just wanted to get the hell out. As I was loading up the truck, I saw something at the edge of the woods. It was standing there again, watching. I got in the truck and drove as fast as I could down that narrow dirt road, barely keeping control. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that voice, and I wonder if it still remembers my name. It was late autumn when I decided to build a small cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. The land was cheap, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. It wasn't much, just a clearing surrounded by thick trees, but it was mine. I had planned this for months, gathering supplies, checking weather reports, and making sure I had everything I needed. The goal was simple: get the walls up, the roof covered, and at least a temporary shelter ready before the heavy winter storms set in. The forecast had called for light rain that evening, but nothing too serious. I figured I could get most of the frame up before dark and then spend the night inside my truck, sleeping in the front seat. It wasn't a comfortable setup, but I had done worse before. The problem with forecasts, though, is that they're rarely right. By the time I had the foundation beams in place, the sky had turned a deep gray. The air was heavy, the kind of pressure that makes your ears pop. I could smell the rain before I even saw it. A damp, earthy scent creeping through the trees. Then it came. It started as a drizzle, light drops tapping against the tools I had laid out. I ignored it, working as quickly as I could. But within minutes, it turned into a downpour, sheets of rain hammering against the ground, turning dirt into thick mud. Water pooled in the holes I had dug, soaking into my boots, making every step feel heavier. I told myself to keep going. The rain wasn't going to stop me. I had been out in the woods plenty of times before, hiking, camping, even hunting when I had the time. But something about being out there alone in the rain, building a shelter from scratch, made the place feel different. The trees, usually welcoming, now stood like dark figures in the mist. The sound of rain drowned out everything else. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the endless drumming on the canopy above. I kept working, my hands stiff with cold. The frame was coming together, rough but solid. I kept glancing back toward my truck, just 100 feet away, parked near the tree line. It looked farther than it should have. I shook it off. I was tired, soaked, and hungry. My mind was playing tricks on me. The first time I noticed, I thought it was nothing. A shape in the trees, barely visible through the rain. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. But as the night crept in, I felt it more and more. The weight of eyes on me. I stopped hammering and looked around. Nothing, just trees, rain, and darkness. But that feeling didn't go away. I worked faster, my hands numb. The rain made everything slippery. My saw kept slipping from my grip, mud caked my clothes, and my arms burned from lifting the heavy beams. Every time I turned back toward my truck, I felt like something had shifted, like the woods were different from how I had last seen them. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a flicker, barely noticeable. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was just the wind moving the branches. I wanted to keep working. I wanted to get that roof up, but I knew when to stop pushing. I had done enough for the night. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the truck. The moment I turned the beam into the trees, I thought I saw something move. A shape, dark and still, blending into the forest. I stood there, staring. My breath came in quick bursts, but when I blinked, it was gone. Maybe it had never been there. I told myself it was nothing, just exhaustion. Inside the truck, I tried to dry off as best as I could. The rain pounded on the windshield, making it impossible to see outside. I turned on the engine for warmth, letting it run for a few minutes before shutting it off to save fuel. I ate a protein bar, washed it down with some water, and tried to settle in. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about that shape in the trees. The rain didn't let up. It only got worse, hammering against the roof of the truck like it was trying to break through. The windows fogged up, and even though I wiped them down, I couldn't see much past the thick downpour. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to a sound. Not the rain, something else. A thud, muffled but clear. I sat up fast, my heart pounding. I reached for the flashlight and aimed it through the windshield. Nothing, just rain and darkness. I turned the light toward the side window and froze. There were footprints in the mud, deep, fresh, leading up to the truck. I hadn't left those. I gripped the flashlight tighter, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew with every part of me that I wasn't alone. I didn't wait. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into reverse. The tires spun in the mud for a second before catching. I backed up fast, then swung around, my headlights cutting through the rain. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, a figure standing near the half-built cabin. Not moving, just standing, watching. I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, bouncing over the rough terrain. My heart pounded as I sped down the narrow dirt path, the headlights barely lighting the way. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I spent the night at a cheap motel on the edge of town, barely sleeping, my mind racing. By morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was clear, bright, like the storm had never happened. I considered going back, finishing the cabin, pretending like nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was out there. Something had been watching me, and it had left footprints. I never went back. I sold the land, losing money in the process, but I didn't care. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some places don't want you there. I still think about that night sometimes. The rain, the feeling of being watched, the footprints, and that figure standing in the darkness, watching as I drove away. I was in my late 30s when I decided to take a break from the noise of city life and retreat to a quiet cabin in the United Kingdom. The year was 2017, and I had been working long hours at a finance job in London. The stress had been piling up, and I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of deadlines and responsibilities. A week away in the countryside seemed like the perfect solution. I found a cabin for rent in Northumberland, near Kielder Forest. It was remote, surrounded by trees, with no other houses nearby. The nearest village was about a 30-minute drive away, and even that was just a handful of cottages, a small shop, and a pub. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, that was what I was looking for. A place where I could breathe, clear my head, and be alone with my thoughts. The cabin itself was simple but comfortable. It had one bedroom, a living area with a wood-burning stove, and a small kitchen. The owner, a man in his 60s named Peter, had told me over the phone that there was no Wi-Fi and limited phone reception. That was fine with me. I wanted to disconnect for a while. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the trees. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. After unloading my things, I made a cup of tea and sat on the porch, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. For the first time in months, I felt calm. That night, I slept deeply, wrapped in the heavy silence of the woods. When I woke up the next morning, I felt refreshed. The day passed peacefully. I took a long walk through the trees, cooked a simple meal, and spent the evening reading by the fire. But as the sun began to set, something shifted. It started with a feeling, a strange, prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was too used to the constant presence of people in the city and wasn't accustomed to being alone. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Later, when I stepped outside to get some firewood, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 20 meters away. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned, long gray coat. Her hair was dark, tangled, and hung loose over her shoulders. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the cabin. My first thought was that she might be lost, maybe a hiker who had wandered too far from the trails. But something about her posture, the way she stood so still, made me hesitate. "Hello," I called out instinctively, but the word felt empty in the open air. She didn't respond. I took a step forward, but as I did, she turned and walked into the trees. Not in a hurry, not running, just walking, as if she hadn't been staring at my cabin for who knows how long. I felt a chill creep over me. Something about her had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Still, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Just some local out for a walk. Maybe a bit strange, but harmless. That night, though, sleep didn't come as easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Not distinct, just a pale shape in the dark. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I kept myself busy, chopping wood, exploring the surrounding area, anything to keep my mind occupied. By the time evening came, I was feeling more at ease. And then, just as the last light of the day faded, I saw her again. She was closer this time, standing in the same spot at the edge of the trees, but this time she was no more than 10 meters from the porch, close enough that I could see her features. A thin face, sunken cheeks, eyes that were too dark in the dim light. My stomach clenched. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, staring at her as she stared back. Then, without warning, she turned and walked into the trees again. Something about the way she moved made my skin crawl. It was deliberate but unnatural, like she wasn't just walking away, but withdrawing. like she had gotten closer on purpose, just to see how I'd react. I locked the doors that night. I double-checked the windows. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that she was just a local woman with odd habits, that she wasn't a threat. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my heart pound. A branch snapping, the wind rustling through the trees. It all felt wrong. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to wait around for another encounter. I packed up my things and loaded them into the car. As I was about to leave, I took one last look at the treeline. She was there, standing at the exact spot where I had seen her the first time, watching. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. When I reached the nearest village, I stopped at the small shop to return the cabin key to Peter. He noticed my pale face and asked if everything was all right. I hesitated, then asked, "Do people ever wander near the cabin?" Peter's expression darkened slightly. "Not usually." "Why?" I considered telling him everything, but instead, I just shook my head. "Just saw someone. Thought it was strange." He nodded slowly. "Well, you're not the first." That was all he said. I didn't ask any more questions. I left Northumberland that day and never went back. Years later, I still think about that woman. About the way she stood so still, the way she got closer, the way she was there that last morning, watching. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, and I don't want to know. It was the end of the summer in 2019 when I decided to take a trip to a remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains. I had been working for months without a break, and I was in desperate need of some solitude. My name's Jack, 35 years old, and I work in IT, so I spend most of my days behind a desk. The thought of getting away from the constant buzz of my phone, the emails, and the endless stream of notifications felt like a blessing. I booked a small, secluded cabin for a weekend to unwind, hoping the fresh air and time alone would give me the recharge I needed. The cabin was located about 3 hours north of Albany, tucked away on the edge of a dense forest. The road leading up to it was narrow, winding, and far from well-maintained. The last stretch of the drive felt like I was heading into nowhere. I remember turning off my phone just before I got to the cabin. It had no service out here, and I figured it would be good to fully disconnect. When I finally arrived, I parked my truck in front of the cabin and stood there for a moment. The place was everything I imagined. A small, wooden structure with a front porch, surrounded by towering pine trees. The air was fresh, crisp with a touch of autumn's chill. The ground around the cabin was scattered with leaves, and a slight breeze rustled through the trees. No signs of life, no noise from traffic or people. Just silence, interrupted only by the occasional call of a distant bird. The cabin itself was old, though it looked well maintained. It had a rustic charm, like something out of a nature magazine. I unlocked the door, grabbed my bag, and stepped inside. The smell of wood and old leather hit me immediately. The interior was cozy. Wooden beams lined the ceiling, and the floors creaked with every step I took. A fireplace sat to the right, its hearth cold and empty, but the rest of the space was inviting. Simple furniture, a small kitchen, a couple of armchairs, and a large window that gave a perfect view of the forest outside. I spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in. I had no real plan except to relax and enjoy the peace. I didn't bother lighting the fireplace, as the weather was still warm enough for just a light jacket. I stepped out onto the porch, sat on one of the rocking chairs, and took in the view. The forest was thick, but I could see the occasional clearing where the sun would shine through the trees, casting long shadows. The first evening passed without incident. I had a small campfire in the backyard, roasted some hot dogs, and spent the rest of the night reading a book by the light of a lantern. As I went to bed, I felt a sense of contentment. I was glad I came here, far away from the distractions of everyday life. But it wasn't long before things started to feel off. I woke up the next morning to the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. It was subtle at first, but it was enough to stir me from my sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening. The sound came again, like fingernails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. I waited, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or some other creature looking for food. I dismissed the thought and forced myself to fall back asleep, but I couldn't shake the unease. When morning finally came, I got up, made some coffee, and went outside to check around the cabin. Nothing. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed, and the trees were still. The only sign of life was the faint trail of smoke rising from my fire pit, where I'd cooked dinner the night before. Could have been nothing. I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. Still, I kept an eye out for the rest of the morning, but nothing seemed unusual. That was until the next day when the noise came again. This time, it was louder, unmistakable. A deep, scraping sound, almost like claws digging into the side of the cabin. It was late afternoon, and I was sitting on the porch when I heard it. I stood up, looking toward the corner of the cabin where the noise had originated. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I felt a chill run down my spine. I walked around the cabin, checking every corner, every window. But again, there was nothing. No animal tracks, no broken branches, just the deep, unsettling silence of the forest. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the noise. It was the sense that someone or something was out there watching me. The wind picked up, and I could hear the rustling of the trees outside, but even that sound felt distant. The cabin felt so isolated, so cut off from the world, and I couldn't help but feel vulnerable. I lay awake for hours, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin, unsure of whether it was the house or something else. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was different. The scraping had stopped, replaced by something more deliberate. A thudding sound, like a fist banging against the wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin, where I had made the fire the night before. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the window, scanning the yard. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and it stood completely still. It was difficult to make out details, but I could see the outline of its shape through the shadows. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching the cabin. I squinted, but the figure didn't come any closer. It didn't make a sound. It was as if it knew I could see it and was just waiting. I pulled away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I considered grabbing my truck keys and leaving, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Fear, maybe, or curiosity. Whatever it was, I couldn't bring myself to move. The figure remained outside for what felt like hours, but I didn't hear it move. It didn't leave. I spent the entire night wide awake, listening for any sound, any movement. The feeling of being watched never left. By morning, the figure was gone. The woods were silent again. There were no footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, just the same empty forest. But the feeling stayed with me. I knew something had been out there, but I couldn't explain what. My logical mind kept telling me it was just my imagination, a trick of the shadows, but deep down, I knew better. I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't want to stay another night. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of being alone in that cabin, with whatever was out there, filled me with a deep primal fear. As I loaded up my truck, I glanced toward the trees one last time, half expecting to see the figure again. But the woods were still. It wasn't until I was halfway down the mountain road, the cabin far behind me, that I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I still don't know what happened that weekend. I don't know who or what was watching me, but I never went back to that cabin. And I never will. The woods might have their secrets, but some things are better left unexplained. The rain came down in sheets, smacking the windshield in a furious rhythm as I navigated the winding dirt road. The headlights from my truck cut through the night, illuminating the dense trees lining either side of me. I'd been driving for hours, leaving the city behind and heading deeper into the mountains. My destination? A cabin I'd inherited from an uncle I barely knew. The cabin sat on an old piece of land, a place my uncle had used as a hunting lodge when he was younger. He'd never married, never had kids, and as far as I knew, he didn't keep much company. I didn't know what to expect, but the idea of escaping the city, the noise, and the stress seemed like a good one. As I turned a corner, the cabin finally came into view. It was exactly as I remembered from the pictures, a rustic structure with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. The place had a certain charm, despite its disrepair. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag, and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit me like a slap in the face, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I made my way to the front door. The key was hidden under the porch like my uncle had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately hit by the musty smell of the old wood. The air was stale, but the cabin had potential. A cozy fireplace sat in the living room, the perfect spot for a fire to chase away the chill. I threw my bag on the couch and set about unpacking. Nightfall came quickly, and with it, an eerie silence. The only sounds were the rain and the occasional creak of the old wood as the house settled. I didn't think much of it, just tried to relax. The warmth from the fire was comforting as I sat back, sipping on a beer. I wasn't expecting anything exciting, just a weekend to get away from it all. But that night, something felt off. I woke up to a strange noise. It was subtle at first, like a faint scratching sound. My eyes flicked open, and I lay still, straining my ears to catch it again. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence. But the sound persisted, growing louder. It was coming from outside. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the couch and made my way to the window. I couldn't see much through the rain-streaked glass, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Then I saw it, a figure moving in the distance, the faint silhouette of a person, moving slowly through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. Who the hell was out there? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and it was far too late for anyone to be walking around out there. I grabbed my jacket, my pulse quickening. I couldn't just ignore it. There was something about that figure, something unsettling in the way it moved. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if I was truly seeing something I shouldn't have, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the yard. The figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the woods. I shivered, whether from the cold or fear, I wasn't sure. I decided to go back inside. As I turned to head back to the cabin, something caught my eye, a small, crumpled piece of paper on the porch. I bent down to pick it up, unfurling it carefully. It was a torn scrap of an old map, and a few words were scrawled on it in smudged ink. "Help me. 3 days." I stared at the note, my mind racing. The message was cryptic, and there was something in the words that sent a chill down my spine. Who was it meant for? Who had left it here? 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. Should I call the cops? Should I leave? But the logical part of me pushed those thoughts aside. It was probably some prank or an old piece of trash that had blown onto the porch. Maybe some local kids had messed with it. But then I heard it again, the scratching sound. I stepped back into the cabin, my pulse spiking. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. I sat on the couch, eyes darting around, my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hours dragged on. Every little noise seemed amplified in the stillness. A crack from the floorboards, a rustle of leaves outside. I kept my flashlight close, my mind racing, as I tried to ignore the gnawing fear settling in my gut. I told myself it was nothing. I had to be overthinking it. But then the scratching grew louder. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was at the door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. Someone or something was at my door. I grabbed the gun my uncle had kept in a drawer in the kitchen. I didn't know how to use it, but the weight of it in my hand gave me some comfort. I crept toward the door, listening for any sound. The scratching had stopped, but I wasn't about to open it. I heard something else now, a low, raspy breath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Whoever or whatever was outside, they were breathing just as hard as I was. I backed away slowly, trying to keep as quiet as possible. The gun was still in my grip, but I wasn't sure what I would do with it if I had to. I needed to figure out what was going on. It was then that I noticed something in the window. A figure standing just outside, watching me. The shadow was tall and thin, too thin, and the way it moved was unnatural. I froze. The figure raised its arm, and I could see something glint in its hand. A knife. A long, sharp knife. My heart raced. I had to do something. I didn't think. I just acted. I bolted for the back door, throwing it open and running into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get away. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slick with mud, and my feet slipped beneath me as I stumbled through the underbrush. I couldn't hear anything behind me, but the sense of being chased was overwhelming. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the leaves felt like someone was right there, closing in on me. I didn't know how long I ran, but I eventually reached the road. My truck was parked just a few hundred yards down the way, and I sprinted toward it, gasping for breath. I didn't stop until I was inside, the engine roaring to life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a payphone and called the police. I told them everything, the note, the figure, the knife. They said they'd send someone to investigate. It wasn't until the next day that they found the cabin. They didn't find anyone there. No sign of forced entry. No evidence of anyone being out in the woods that night. Nothing. But they did find something, the body of a man, buried just a few yards behind the cabin. He'd been dead for years, the body mummified, but it was clear he'd been murdered. The police couldn't identify him, and the case went cold. But the note, the cryptic message, stayed with me. I never went back to the cabin. I sold it off, not caring who bought it. I don't know if the killer was still out there, but I don't think I want to know. Some things, I guess, are better left buried. It was the middle of October, and the cold had already crept into the bones of the forest. The trees had turned a dull brown, their leaves scattered across the dirt road like forgotten remnants of the summer. I had been sent out to cover a remote cabin deep in the woods for a routine patrol. Nothing unusual, but I had been feeling on edge for days. I couldn't explain why, but something was off. The cabin sat alone, nestled between two thick stands of pine trees that barely let the sun break through. It had once belonged to an old woodsman, but now it was used for county deputies as a base of operations for those who patrolled the rural stretches of land that few people ever ventured into. I had been assigned to work a night shift there, something that didn't sit well with me. Maybe it was the isolation, the silence, or the dark woods pressing in on all sides. Whatever it was, my instincts were screaming at me to turn back. The drive there had been long and uneventful. The engine of my patrol truck hummed steadily as I made my way down narrow, winding roads. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the chill in the air had settled into my bones. I parked the truck by the front door and gathered my gear, making sure to lock the vehicle behind me. The heavy door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of stale air hit me like a punch in the face. The cabin was old, built from thick logs that had weathered over time but still held strong. There was a single light above the door that flickered, adding to the sense of desolation. Inside, the space was small. A few wooden chairs, a coffee table, and a fire pit in the center of the room. The fireplace was cold and unused. It was the kind of place that didn't need to be fancy, just functional. I hung my jacket on the back of a chair and made my way to the desk in the corner to fill out the paperwork for my shift. But the feeling of unease gnawed at me. I sat there for what felt like hours, the silence pressing in from every angle. No wind, no sound of animals, nothing. It was as if the whole world had gone still. I could hear my own breathing, the faint scratching of my pen against the paper. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, the wind finally started to pick up. It whistled through the cracks in the cabin, making the old wood groan and creak. I stood up to grab a fresh cup of coffee from the small kitchen, hoping it would clear my head. That's when I heard it. A noise outside, a soft thud, followed by the crunch of gravel. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but then I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking right up to the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and walked cautiously to the window. I peered through the small gap in the curtain, my breath fogging up the glass. The moon was low, casting long shadows across the yard. There, just beyond the porch light, I saw him, a man, tall and hunched, standing just out of reach of the light. My mind raced. This wasn't right. I was alone. I knew for a fact that there hadn't been any calls for service out here tonight. No one should be here. My fingers tightened around the flashlight. I debated my next move. I could call for backup, but it would take at least 20 minutes for anyone to get here. And then I remembered my training. Never assume it's just someone passing through. In this line of work, you trust your gut. And my gut was telling me that this wasn't an innocent wanderer. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The man didn't move. The silence outside seemed to deepen. My hand hovered near my gun holster. After a moment, the man stepped forward, his feet crunching against the gravel as he approached the door. I froze, barely breathing, praying he wouldn't notice the light inside the cabin. But of course he did. The man's eyes flashed toward the window where I stood. For a brief second, our gazes locked, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't know what to make of it. He was gone just as quickly as he'd appeared, vanishing into the shadows. But my heart was still pounding in my chest. I had a bad feeling about this. I debated whether to follow him. But what if he was just someone lost in the woods? What if he was dangerous? It wasn't worth risking it. I stayed inside, keeping the lights low and my eyes trained on the door. For the next few hours, I stayed alert, my mind racing. Sleep wasn't an option. The next morning, the sun finally began to rise, casting a weak light over the forest. I hadn't seen or heard anything else from the man, but my nerves were shot. I decided to head out to check the area around the cabin for any signs of him. My boots crunched against the gravel as I stepped outside. The air was still cold, but the wind had died down. I walked around the cabin, looking for any evidence of the man from last night. And then I saw it. Footprints. Large, heavy prints in the dirt leading toward the back of the cabin. I followed them, my heart pounding once again. They led into the woods, but after a few yards, the prints stopped. No more steps. Nothing. I glanced around, unsure of what to do next. Should I go back to the truck and drive out? Should I call it in? But as I stood there, I heard something. A faint sound from deeper in the woods. A rustling. Something was moving through the trees. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I wasn't trained for this. I was supposed to be patrolling the area, making sure everything was secure, but now I felt like prey. Slowly, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the woods, before turning to head back toward the cabin. And that's when I saw him again. The man from last night. He was standing near the trees, only this time he wasn't alone. 2 others stood with him. They were all wearing dark clothing, and their faces were partially obscured by the shadows. I froze, unsure of what to do. My hand reached for my gun, but before I could pull it free, one of them raised something. A rifle. I was too slow. The shot rang out and everything went black. Took me a long time to wake up. When I did, everything hurt. My head was pounding, and my body felt like it had been run over by a truck. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I was lying on the ground, a few feet from the cabin. The cold air stung my skin, but there was no sound, no movement. My gun was gone. I forced myself to sit up. My stomach lurched. There was blood, so much blood, staining the ground beneath me. I touched my chest, feeling the warm wetness of it. I wasn't dead. Not yet. I slowly stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The woods were silent. I could hear nothing but my own ragged breath. My mind raced, piecing together the events. Those men, they hadn't just been trespassers. They'd come for me. They had been waiting, watching. I stumbled toward the cabin, determined to get to the radio inside. I couldn't let them get away with this. I had to call it in, warn anyone who might be nearby. My hands shook as I reached for the door, but before I could open it, I heard a voice. It was familiar. I turned, and there he was, the man who had shot me. But now something was different. He was standing in the doorway of the cabin, his gun aimed directly at me. The other 2 men were with him, their eyes cold and unblinking. I tried to raise my hands, but the blood was still pouring from my chest, and I couldn't keep my balance. He stepped forward, his eyes dark and empty. "You should have stayed away," he said, his voice low. And then, without another word, he pulled the trigger. The investigation later showed that they were a group of rogue cops. They had been running a smuggling ring for months, and I had stumbled onto their operation. They had set up the cabin as a trap, knowing that I'd be assigned to work there. The other deputies found my body 2 days later, buried in the woods not far from the cabin. It was over. The killers were brought to justice. But for me, it was too late. I never made it out. It was late summer, the kind of late summer that made the evenings feel cooler but still carried that humidity from the day's heat. The cabin, nestled at the edge of the forest, was an unexpected refuge. I had always been used to living in a suburban neighborhood, but when I bought the house next to Kyle and Laura, my life took a strange turn. Kyle, my neighbor, was one of those people who always seemed too perfect. His smile was polished, his house always neat, and he had that aura of confidence that made him the sort of guy everyone else wanted to be. His wife, Laura, was striking. Her blonde hair framed her face in waves, and she had this calm, collected demeanor. It wasn't until the strange events began that I realized there was much more to them than I initially thought. It all started when they invited me to their cabin for the weekend. I wasn't particularly close to them, just casual greetings over the fence or during short talks while taking out the trash. But when Kyle extended the offer, I couldn't say no. The idea of a weekend retreat sounded good. And besides, It was a chance to get out of the house and clear my head. The drive was longer than I expected, winding roads leading up to a remote area where the trees were thick, and the silence was almost oppressive. When we finally reached the cabin, I was taken aback by its location. So far removed from anything. No neighbors for miles. The air smelled different here, like earth and pine, and there was a quiet that settled over everything. The cabin itself wasn't large, but it was cozy. Wooden beams crisscrossed overhead, and there was a stone fireplace that dominated the main living room. Kyle and Laura were already settling in, and I was about to do the same when I noticed another person there. Laura's stepsister, Emily. I had heard a little about her, but she was never around much. She had long, dark hair and an aloof look in her eyes. It didn't take long for me to pick up on the tension between her and Kyle. Maybe it was just the way she kept stealing glances at him, but it was there, unmistakable. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it wasn't my business. That first evening was calm. We sat around the fire, drinking, laughing, and talking. The crackle of the logs in the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside were the only sounds. It felt like a perfect night until the atmosphere began to shift. I couldn't say exactly when it started, but by the time dinner was done, things felt off. I chalked it up to the alcohol and the remoteness of the place. Maybe it was just me, but I noticed that Laura seemed on edge. She kept glancing out the windows, as if expecting someone to appear from the dark woods. Emily was quiet, but she had a way of watching everything from the shadows. I didn't want to overthink it, so I excused myself and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The air had turned cold, and the quietness outside seemed oppressive. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirp of insects were gone. It was as though the entire woods had held its breath. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Then I heard it, a soft thud, not from outside but from somewhere inside the cabin. I held my breath, straining my ears. Another thud. It was coming from the kitchen. I waited for a few minutes, thinking maybe it was just the house settling. But no, it came again, louder this time, then a faint sound, almost like something or someone moving through the kitchen. I pushed the blankets off and slowly crept out of bed, trying not to make a sound. My feet hit the cold floor, and I padded quietly toward the hallway. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, and I could see faint light flickering from the fire still burning in the hearth. I walked in, and to my surprise, I found Kyle standing by the window, looking out into the darkness. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice low. He didn't answer right away, just stood there, staring. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. The woods were dense, and the darkness was thick. I almost thought I could make out figures moving at the edge of the trees, but it was probably just my mind playing tricks. "I thought I heard something," Kyle said, his voice strained. "Might have been the wind, or an animal." I didn't know what to say. Maybe he was just nervous. After all, he lived here with his wife and her sister, far from anything, and maybe the isolation was getting to him. We both stood there for a few moments before he turned and gave a quick, forced smile. "I'll head back to bed. Don't worry about it." But as he walked away, I caught a glimpse of something else. A shadow moving too fast, too deliberately, outside the window. My heart skipped a beat. Kyle didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, the tension was thick. Kyle seemed distracted, his movements quick and jerky. Laura kept looking out the window, her eyes darting nervously to the trees. Emily stayed in the background, watching everyone with a calculating look on her face. The whole cabin felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't figure out why. The calm I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by something darker. It wasn't until we were sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, that things finally started to unravel. Laura, who had been unusually quiet all morning, suddenly turned to Emily with a hard look in her eyes. "I don't trust you here, Emily," Laura said, her voice low but sharp. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled that eerie smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't trust you either," she said, her voice almost a whisper. The air between them grew cold, and I felt an odd sense of dread settle in my stomach. Kyle stood up abruptly, pacing away from the porch. Laura didn't take her eyes off Emily, and for the first time, I noticed the anger in her expression. It wasn't the first time I'd seen that look. In fact, it felt like something had been building for a long time. But it was only then that I realized that the three of them, Kyle, Laura, and Emily, had a complicated, tangled history that I had only glimpsed. As the day dragged on, I kept noticing small things I hadn't seen before, but in hindsight seemed obvious. The way Kyle's eyes would linger too long on Emily, or how Laura seemed to disappear for hours at a time, only to reappear with that tight, forced smile. I couldn't help but feel like there was something they weren't telling me. It was later that evening, after a dinner that felt like it was falling apart, that things took a more sinister turn. I was alone in the living room, staring into the fire, trying to make sense of everything when I heard something again. This time, the thud wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was coming from upstairs. I stood up, heart pounding. There was no way anyone else could have been up there. Kyle and Laura had been downstairs, and Emily hadn't moved. I crept toward the stairs, and as I reached the bottom, I saw the silhouette of someone moving in the hallway. The figure was tall and had a strange, jerky way of moving, like they were trying to be quiet but were failing. I backed away, my hand on the railing, when the figure turned, revealing Emily's face. But there was something wrong about it. Her eyes were wide, almost crazed, and her skin had a strange pallor to it. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me. "Emily?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. She just turned and moved toward the stairs, her movements slow and deliberate. I followed her, heart hammering in my chest. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. There, in the dim light, I saw the truth. The entire cabin had been a trap. The twisted history between Kyle, Laura, and Emily wasn't just some family drama. It was something darker, something far more sinister, and I had been caught in the middle of it all. When I finally got out of the cabin, it felt like I had left the weight of a lifetime behind me. I never spoke to any of them again, but I knew, deep down, that something had broken in that cabin, something I could never forget. The silence that followed was deafening, and that's when I realized the real danger wasn't just the things you see in the dark. It was the things you never see coming. The cabin had always been my escape, a place where I could leave behind the chaos of everyday life. Tucked away in the arid, desolate stretches of New Mexico, it stood at the edge of a dry arroyo. There was no one around for miles except the occasional hiker or wildlife, and the isolation was part of what made it so peaceful. Or so I thought. It was late October when I decided to make the trip again. The air was crisp, and the leaves were beginning to turn gold, their dry rustle blending with the wind. I'd left my city life behind for a few days to recharge. It had been a rough year, work was stressful, and the city had a way of draining me. The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary, a few days of solitude to reset, get some fresh air, and clear my mind. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a weekend in the desert, disconnected from everything. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows on the cracked earth. The cabin was a small, rustic place, built decades ago by my grandfather. It wasn't much, just a wood frame structure with a tin roof, a small porch, and a single room with a few basic amenities. The electricity was spotty at best, and water came from a well behind the cabin. It was primitive, but it was enough. After unloading my gear, I made my way inside, closing the door behind me and taking in the familiar, musty smell of old wood. There was a certain calmness in the air, a silence that you could almost feel pressing in on you. I liked it, though. The stillness was soothing. I set up my things in the corner, unpacking my clothes and the few supplies I'd brought with me. As I moved about, my footsteps echoed in the empty room. The only sounds were the faint creaks of the old wood and the distant call of a crow. Nightfall came quickly, as it always did in the desert. By the time I had the fire crackling in the stove, the temperature had dropped, and the first chill of the evening had settled in. I'd eaten a quick meal, some canned chili, and a couple of tortillas, and now, as I sat by the fire, I felt that familiar peace. No calls to answer, no emails to check. Just me, the crackle of the fire, and the night outside. But it wasn't long before something felt off. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just the silence getting to me. The way the night had a way of creeping in when you were alone, the shadows just a little too long, the wind a little too gusty. I brushed it off and turned my attention back to the fire. But then I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, a low thud, like something hitting the ground outside the cabin. I froze, listening. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but the noise was different. It wasn't the wind. It was too solid, too deliberate. I stood up, uneasy, and walked to the window. The glass was cracked in a few places, the wood surrounding it weathered and old. I peered through the gaps, squinting into the dark. The desert was still. There was nothing to see, no movement, nothing out of place. I chalked it up to my imagination and decided to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I was pulled back into consciousness by the slightest sound. A branch snapping, the wind gusting against the cabin. My mind kept circling back to that thud I'd heard earlier. What was it? A deer? A rock falling from the ridge? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At around 2 a.m., I woke up again, this time to a louder noise. A scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground just outside the cabin. My heart started to pound as I sat up in bed. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to look, but curiosity, or perhaps fear, got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slowly made my way to the door. My hand shook slightly as I turned the knob, pushing it open. The cold desert air hit me immediately, sharp and dry, carrying the scent of sage and dust. I shone the beam of light out into the darkness. The ground was empty, nothing but the faint outline of the arroyo in the distance. I took a deep breath, feeling foolish. There was no reason to be scared. Nothing had happened. It was probably just an animal, or maybe I was hearing things in the silence. But as I stepped out onto the porch, something caught my eye. A faint glimmer of something metallic near the edge of the yard. The beam of my flashlight bounced off it, and I froze. It was a small, rusted metal object, half buried in the dirt. I crouched down to examine it. A piece of metal, jagged and torn, with dark stains along its edges. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just any piece of scrap metal. It was a knife covered in dirt and blood. Panic surged through me. I stood up quickly, the blood rushing to my head as I felt my breath quicken. I scanned the area again, this time more frantically. The beam of my flashlight caught nothing but shadows, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I ran back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it without thinking, my heart still racing in my chest. My mind was spinning. What the hell was going on? I needed to leave. I should have packed up and gone right then. But I didn't. Something kept me there, an instinct to stay, to face whatever was happening. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe the fact that I was now too afraid to even contemplate leaving. I didn't know, but I stayed. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I wasn't sure. My thoughts kept spiraling. I couldn't go to sleep now, not with the knife outside, not with whatever was out there. I kept the flashlight on, moving it around the room, trying to make sure nothing was hiding in the corners. I tried to keep my mind occupied, but it was no use. My nerves were shot. At some point, I heard it again, a soft scratching. This time, it was closer, almost inside the cabin. I whipped around, shining the light toward the sound. There, by the door, a thin strip of wood had been scraped away. The floorboards beneath the door were starting to splinter, as if something was trying to pry its way in. My blood ran cold. The door was solid. There was no way it could have opened on its own. And yet, the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was trying to get in. In that moment, I knew that I wasn't just imagining things. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my things and ran outside, not caring if I left everything behind. I made a break for the car, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran down the dirt path. My thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear. I wasn't staying another night at that cabin. I wouldn't even finish packing up. When I finally got to the car, I slammed the door shut and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but I didn't look back. Couldn't. I drove straight to the nearest town, barely stopping for gas. I didn't even bother going back for my stuff. The cabin, the knife, the scraping sound, it didn't matter anymore. I was done. Later, I would find out that there had been reports of people going missing in that part of the desert. Not just hikers or tourists, people who had been staying in remote cabins like mine. No one knew what happened to them, but the local authorities suspected it was more than just wildlife. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had been lurking outside that cabin, waiting for me, had been watching long before I arrived. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't need to. It wasn't the peace I was looking for, and it never would be. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, sitting in a small, creaky cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense trees and the unsettling quiet of the night. The year is 2024, and I'm 32, just a regular guy who decided to get away for a weekend to clear my mind. I had been going through a tough time. Work was stressful and I needed a break, so I booked a cabin, thinking a few days in the wilderness would help me reset. The cabin was located in the backwoods of northern Idaho, a couple of hours outside of Coeur d'Alene. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in a horror movie. A small, wood-paneled building with a slanted roof and a front porch that creaked when you stepped on it. No neighbors for miles, just miles of trees and dirt roads. At first, the isolation felt peaceful. I imagined long hikes through the woods, fishing in the nearby lake, and sitting by a fire at night, drinking beer and reading a good book. But as soon as I arrived, something felt off. It wasn't the cabin itself. On the outside, it was charming in its own way. But there was a presence in the air, a feeling I couldn't shake, the kind of unease that sits at the back of your mind, making you glance over your shoulder more often than you'd like. The owner of the cabin, a man named Charlie, was an older guy who greeted me with a handshake that was just a little too firm. He gave me a quick rundown of the place, how the generator worked, where the firewood was stacked, and that I should be careful about the wild animals that roamed around. He mentioned something about some local folks who lived a few miles down the road, but he was vague about it. After about 15 minutes, he was on his way, leaving me alone with the silence. The first few hours weren't so bad. I unpacked my things, set up the fire pit outside, and made myself comfortable. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting an orange glow over the trees, and the temperature dropped. I went inside to make dinner, nothing fancy, just some canned soup and crackers. As I ate, the isolation began to settle in. The cabin creaked and groaned as if it was alive, the wind howling outside, pushing against the thin walls. But it wasn't just the wind that made me uneasy. It was the quiet, the absolute silence. No birds, no distant hum of a highway, no rustling of animals. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath. That night, after I'd finished my meal, I decided to sit out on the porch. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed to stretch endlessly above me. I had a beer in hand, and for a while, I just sat there, listening to the sounds of the night. But then, out of nowhere, I heard something. A faint rustling in the woods nearby. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. My heart rate quickened, and I stood up, scanning the dark tree line, trying to see if I could spot anything. But there was nothing. I chalked it up to the wind or perhaps a squirrel, though something about it didn't sit right with me. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The next day was uneventful. I went for a hike, exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were dense, and the trail was barely visible, but I kept going, figuring I could use the exercise. The whole time, I felt like someone was just out of sight, trailing behind me. I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone or something in the distance, but there was never anything there. By late afternoon, I made my way back to the cabin, feeling more on edge than before. As I approached the front door, I noticed something strange. A small pile of dirt at the edge of the porch. It didn't look like it had been there before. The dirt wasn't scattered or blown by the wind. It was neat, almost like someone had intentionally placed it there. I knelt down, running my fingers through the dirt, and found something buried beneath it. A small, weathered rock, almost like a marker. It didn't seem significant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow important. I left it where I found it and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, the wind picked up again, howling around the cabin, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, footsteps in the distance. But every time I got up to look, there was nothing. The next day, I decided to cut my trip short. This wasn't the relaxing getaway I had imagined. I was ready to go home, but when I packed up my things and went to leave, the truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered but didn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the gas. Plenty of fuel. I tried the battery. Seemed fine. But when I tried starting it a third time, I heard something in the woods. A low, distant hum like a drone. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. I grabbed my phone and tried calling Charlie, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate just outside the cabin. Not the kind of footsteps that would come from an animal. This was something human. I ran to the window, peeking through the blinds. I couldn't see anything at first, but then, as my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that blended into the shadows, but his face was obscured by the darkness. My heart raced. I couldn't tell if he was looking at me, but I had the distinct feeling that he was. I stepped back from the window, trying to steady my breath. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. Should I confront him? Call for help? But there was no phone signal, and I had no way of knowing if he was alone. I decided to stay low, keeping out of sight. I could hear him moving around the cabin, the crunch of his boots on the gravel outside. He wasn't in a hurry. He was taking his time, like he knew I was inside, like he knew I was waiting for him to make a move. The minutes stretched into hours. I stayed as quiet as possible, not daring to make a sound. The only thing I could hear was the soft rustling of the trees and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. At one point, I thought I heard a door creak, but I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was imagining it. Eventually, the noise stopped. It was like the man had disappeared into thin air. The hum in the distance had faded too, leaving behind an eerie silence. I didn't dare move, not yet. I waited, unsure of how long I stayed there, frozen in place. But when I finally built up the courage to check, the figure was gone. There was no trace of him, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my stuff, got in the truck, and managed to get the engine started on the first try. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached town, and I never did go back to that cabin. In the days that followed, I thought about what had happened over and over again. Who was the man? What did he want? And why had he been out there watching me? I never got answers, but I do know one thing. There's something out there in those woods. Something that doesn't want you to stay. Something that doesn't want you to know. The cabin was just a place to rest, but the forest, it's a place that holds secrets. And sometimes, it's better not to know what's hiding just beyond the trees. It had been a long day of hiking through the woods, the trees stretching high into the sky like skeletal giants. The air was thick with the earthy scent of damp leaves, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and lingers in your nostrils even after you've left the forest. The sun was just starting to set when I arrived at the cabin, and the last of the day's light barely filtered through the trees. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. A weekend alone in a cabin, far away from the noise and distractions of daily life. Just me, nature, and the solitude. The cabin was tucked away in a small clearing, the wooden structure weathered by time but sturdy enough to feel safe. It had an old, rustic charm with a small front porch that creaked underfoot. The roof was slanted and covered with moss, the windows dark with the shadows of dusk. As I made my way to the door, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that settles in deep, making everything feel still and heavy. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional bird call, which quickly faded as the sun dipped lower. I stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The cabin smelled of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic. I chalked it up to age. The place hadn't been used in a while, and it wasn't unusual for cabins like this to have a bit of a musty scent. It had a few basic furnishings, a small table, an old couch with worn fabric, a fireplace with a pile of dry wood stacked neatly beside it. The windows were covered by heavy curtains that blocked out most of the fading light. I set my backpack down by the door and began unloading my gear. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it. The solitude was exactly what I wanted, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of the world slip away. It was just me now. I started a fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling as they grew. The warmth spread through the cabin, and I sank into one of the armchairs nearby, letting the fire light dance across the walls. The glow flickered and shifted, casting long, exaggerated shadows. It was peaceful in a way that felt foreign, like everything in the world had slowed down just for me. But as the night stretched on, the peace started to feel more like a weight. I noticed the sounds. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then I realized that the creaks and groans I was hearing weren't coming from the house itself, but from somewhere outside. The soft thudding of something moving in the woods, just beyond the trees. It wasn't an animal, or at least not one I could easily identify. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps. I stood up from the chair, my muscles stiff from sitting too long, and walked over to the window. The heavy curtains didn't allow much light in, but I pulled them back just enough to peer out. The darkness swallowed everything. The trees swayed gently, but there was nothing else. No movement, no sign of life. I shook my head, trying to push the unease away. It was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. The kind of thing that makes noise but disappears as soon as you look for it. But still, the feeling gnawed at me, a tiny whisper in the back of my mind telling me to be cautious. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. I decided to step outside. The fire inside was still burning brightly, but I needed some fresh air, needed to clear my head. The cool night air hit me as soon as I opened the door, sending a chill through my body. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stepped down onto the porch. The woods around me were quiet now, the wind almost non-existent. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves underfoot as I walked down the small path leading away from the cabin. I didn't go far, just enough to take in the surroundings. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting and reaching like gnarled hands. The air smelled different out here, sharper, colder. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing, just the cabin in the distance, its flickering light like a tiny beacon in the vast expanse of dark forest. Still, the sensation lingered. I told myself it was nothing, just the isolation, the kind of feeling you get when you're alone for too long in a place like this. I stayed outside for a while longer, trying to shake the unease. Eventually, I made my way back to the cabin, the door creaking shut behind me. I locked it, then sat down at the table, trying to calm my mind. The fire crackled merrily in the corner, but it did little to ease the tension that had taken root in my chest. It wasn't until later, after I had eaten a simple dinner and cleaned up, that the real fear started to settle in. I had been reading a book by the fire when I heard it again, the thud. It was louder this time, closer. I froze, my eyes darting to the window. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it, that creeping, suffocating presence just outside the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, staring at the darkened woods through the glass. I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought with me and walked to the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. The door was locked, but I double-checked it anyway before stepping outside again. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my mind was racing. It was stupid to go outside in the dark like this, but the curiosity, no, the fear, was too much to ignore. The air outside was colder than before, biting at my skin, and the woods felt even darker now. The flashlight's beam barely cut through the thick darkness. I moved cautiously down the path, each step feeling heavier than the last. My breath came in short bursts, misting in the cold night air. The thudding stopped. I paused, listening hard. There was nothing. No sound, no movement. The stillness was unbearable. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees. But there was nothing there. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. It had to be nothing, just an animal, maybe the wind. But then I saw it. Just at the edge of the light's reach, there was something, a figure, tall, thin, and pale, standing motionless among the trees. I froze, my blood running cold. It was a person, but they weren't moving. They were just standing there watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step backward, my mind racing. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body against the dark trees, but I knew, deep down, that they had been watching me for a while. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but the figure never moved. Slowly, carefully, I started to back away, my eyes never leaving the shadowy form. The footsteps I had heard earlier started again, but this time they were loud and unmistakable. Someone or something was walking toward me. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I thought possible, my feet pounding the ground as I sprinted back toward the cabin. My breath came in sharp gasps, my chest burning, but I couldn't stop. The figure was still there, still out in the woods, and the sound of footsteps was getting closer. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it with shaking hands. I leaned against the door, listening to the silence. The footsteps had stopped, but I wasn't alone anymore. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my back pressed against the door, my eyes darting to every shadow. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. But I was too scared to move, too scared to sleep. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the morning, when the light finally broke through the trees, I ventured outside again. The air was still, and the woods were silent. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt, no broken branches. It was as if the figure had never been there. But I knew better. I had seen it. I had felt its presence. And for the first time, I realized how small and insignificant I was in the vast, wild world of the forest. I left the cabin that day, not bothering to pack up. I just grabbed my things and left. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But there was nothing. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone. Not really. Not in that cabin. Not in the woods. I'll never go back there. I've worked as a park ranger in the northern parts of Montana for the last 6 years, and I've gotten used to the solitude that comes with the job. Most of the time, it's quiet. The wind through the trees, the occasional wildlife sightings, and the long shifts where the biggest threat might be a rattlesnake or the unpredictable weather. But there are nights, a few every year, when everything changes, when things go wrong, when the woods are not as friendly as they seem. It was the beginning of November, and the weather had already started turning. The leaves had all fallen, the sky was perpetually overcast, and the cold air had a way of biting deep into your bones. It was the kind of cold that made you want to curl up next to a fire and forget the rest of the world existed. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option for me. The ranger's cabin, my home during the long stretches of my shift, was a lonely building located in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense pine forests and miles of unmarked trails. I was alone that night. The rest of the rangers had gone to town for the weekend, leaving me to monitor the area on my own. I didn't mind it, honestly. I preferred it that way. There was something calming about the solitude. The silence was thick and almost comforting, like the forest itself was wrapping its arms around me, protecting me from everything else. I spent most of the day checking the trail markers, fixing a few fences, and making sure no illegal hunters had wandered into the area. The job was routine, easy even. The only thing that ever disturbed the peace was the occasional hiker, and most of them stayed on the designated paths. But that night was different. That night, things didn't stay quiet. The sun dipped behind the trees around 5:30, and the darkness quickly spread, leaving me in an eerie twilight that always made the woods feel like a different world. I had finished my rounds and was back in the cabin, drinking a cup of lukewarm coffee when I heard it. A faint knock on the door. Now, the knock didn't bother me at first. There were people that passed through occasionally, rangers from other stations, hikers who got lost, or even locals who might need help with something. But this was different. It wasn't a polite knock, like someone asking for help or trying to be friendly. It was a hard, fast knock. 3 quick bangs and then silence. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the door, a sense of unease slowly creeping up my spine. Through the small window, I could see nothing but the dark outline of the trees. I opened the door slightly, just enough to peek outside, but there was no one there, just the cold, silent night. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then I heard it again, only this time it came from the back of the cabin, the direction of the woods. 3 knocks, same rhythm, no voice, no footsteps, just the knocks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my heart rate pick up. My first instinct was to reach for my radio, but I stopped myself. This was my job. I couldn't just call in for backup every time something felt off. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me immediately. The beam from the flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the path that led to the rear of the cabin. There was nothing there. No signs of movement, no footprints, just the rustling of the wind through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something about the night felt wrong. I spent the next hour pacing around the cabin, checking every corner, making sure all the windows were locked and the doors were secured. Nothing was out of place, but the feeling of being watched never left. I tried to focus on something else. My tasks, the reports I had to file, but I kept glancing nervously out the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the dark. Around midnight, I heard the knock again, louder this time, coming from the woods. I froze, my hands still gripping the flashlight. This wasn't a random knock. This was deliberate. Someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I should have called for help. I should have locked the doors, turned on every light, and waited until morning. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my rifle from the rack near the door and stepped outside once more, the chill of the night air biting into my skin. I had a job to do, and if someone needed help, I wasn't going to run from it. The knock came again, almost as if it was mocking me. 3 sharp, precise bangs. This time, I was certain it came from the trees, beyond the reach of the cabin's lights. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The forest had gone completely silent, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the beating of my heart. I moved toward the treeline, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. As I walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the silence became oppressive. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving between the trees. But when I focused the beam on it, I saw a figure standing there, just at the edge of the forest. A man, tall and thin, with a hood pulled low over his face. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, perfectly still, watching me. I stopped in my tracks, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, but my body refused to move. Was it a trespasser, a hunter, or something worse? The man didn't seem to be carrying anything. No rifle, no bag, just standing there like some kind of sentinel. I called out to him, but my voice sounded weak in the vast emptiness of the forest. No response, just the rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. I took a step closer, my rifle raised in front of me, my finger hovering over the trigger. The man didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge me. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he disappeared into the woods. Not a sound, not a snap of a twig, nothing. He was just gone. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. My mind screamed at me to run back to the cabin, lock the doors, and never come back. But I couldn't. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let some figure in the woods intimidate me. I cautiously moved in the direction he had gone, but I couldn't find a trace of him. No footprints, no broken branches. It was as if he had never been there. I made my way back to the cabin, every instinct in my body telling me to leave, to get in my truck and drive until I was out of the forest. But I stayed. I stayed because it was my duty, because I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that whatever had been in those woods wasn't done yet. I spent the rest of the night with the windows locked and the lights on, rifle in hand. I didn't hear any more knocks. I didn't see the figure again, but the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, I went out to check the area once more. I expected to find something. Footprints, signs of the man, maybe something that would explain what had happened. But there was nothing. The woods were as calm and still as they always were. I reported it, of course, told the other rangers what had happened, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. Maybe they thought I was overreacting. Maybe they thought I just imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. And I knew that something wasn't right in those woods. A week later, a hiker went missing in the same area. It wasn't the first time someone had gotten lost in the woods, but this one felt different. This one felt connected. The search teams never found him. The only thing they found was his backpack, abandoned in the middle of the trail. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were hiding something that wasn't human. It's been years since that night, and I still think about it. Every time I hear a knock on the door or see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, I remember that man in the woods, and I know deep down that the forest is not as safe as it seems, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched.